Hey there, welcome back to another journey through forgotten history. Tonight, we're heading to a place where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, where dust clouds marked the passage of thousands of cattle, and where survival often came down to what could be cooked over an open fire in the middle of nowhere. But before we begin this culinary adventure, I have a question that might surprise you. What if I told you that the most important person on a cattle drive wasn't the trail boss, wasn't the most skilled rider, and definitely wasn't the fastest gun? What if the man who held the power of life and death over an entire crew never carried a weapon at all? Tonight, we're diving deep into a world where a pot of beans could prevent a mutiny, where the wrong coffee could start a fight, and where one man's cooking skills determined whether 20 riders lived or died on the trail. This isn't the Hollywood version of the Wild West with its saloon scenes and dramatic showdowns. This is the story of survival, told through the most basic human need, the need to eat. We're going to uncover secrets that most cowboy movies get completely wrong. Did you know that despite driving thousands of cattle across the plains, cowboys almost never ate beef? Can you imagine surviving for months on just 3 basic ingredients, prepared in ways that would make modern chefs weep? And wait until you discover the ingenious invention that revolutionized frontier life, a mobile kitchen so clever that its basic design is still used today. But here's what really hooks me about this story. Buried in these tales of beans and hardtack, of coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe and bread baked in Dutch ovens under starlit skies, we find something profound about human nature. We discover how people adapt, how they create community around the most basic acts, and how they find meaning in the simplest pleasures when everything else has been stripped away. So, dim the lights. Maybe brew yourself a cup of coffee, though nothing like what we're about to encounter, and let's ride back to a time when the American West was still wild, when millions of cattle thundered across endless grasslands, and when the difference between a good day and a disaster often came down to what was cooking in the chuckwagon. Trust me, by the end of tonight's journey, you'll never look at a simple pot of beans the same way again. And that story I mentioned about the most powerful man on the trail, well, that's just the beginning of what we're about to uncover. The birth of the chuckwagon. Picture this. It's 1866, and America is just beginning to heal from the devastation of the Civil War. Cities in the North are hungry for beef, their populations swollen with immigrants and returning soldiers. Meanwhile, in Texas, millions of longhorn cattle roam freely across the range, descendants of Spanish stock, hardy as mesquite, and worth almost nothing where they grazed. But wait, here's where our story gets interesting, because the solution to this problem would create something entirely new in human history: the greatest mobile kitchen ever devised. Charles Goodnight. Now there was a man who understood problems and solutions. A former Texas Ranger, he looked at those worthless Texas cattle and those hungry northern markets separated by 1,000 miles of wilderness, and he saw opportunity. But Goodnight also saw the fundamental challenge that had stumped cattlemen for years. How do you keep 20 or 30 men fed and functional for months on end while crossing terrain where there are no towns, no stores, no reliable sources of food or water? The answer came to him in a moment of pure frontier genius. Goodnight took a military surplus wagon, sturdy enough to survive the punishment of crossing rivers, climbing mountains, and grinding across endless prairie, and he transformed it into something that had never existed before. At the back of this wagon, he built what he called a chuck box, a cabinet fitted with drawers and shelves, designed to hold everything a cook might need: flour, coffee, beans, salt pork, medical supplies, ammunition, even tools for wagon repair. But here's the brilliant part. The back of this chuck box folded down to create a work surface. Suddenly, in the middle of nowhere, a cook had something resembling a kitchen. The wagon carried water barrels, a coffee grinder, Dutch ovens, and everything else needed to feed a crew. It was mobile, organized, and efficient. The chuckwagon was born. Now, you might think this is just a nice story about frontier ingenuity, but you'd be missing the deeper significance. What Goodnight had created wasn't just a mobile kitchen. It was the beating heart of a new kind of community. For the next 30 years, as millions of cattle moved north from Texas to railheads in Kansas and beyond, the chuckwagon would become the most important structure on the American frontier. Think about it. In a world without permanent buildings, without towns, without any of the social structures that normally bind people together, the chuckwagon became home. It was where the crew gathered for meals, where they shared stories, where they nursed injuries and settled disputes. It was the center of their temporary universe, and the man who controlled it wielded enormous power. But who was this man? Who became the cook on these epic journeys? And how did he come to hold such influence over tough, independent cowboys who answered to no one? That's where our story takes a fascinating turn, because the men who ended up wielding ladles instead of lassos were often the most interesting characters on the entire drive. Stay with me, because what we're about to discover about these frontier cooks will change everything you thought you knew about the hierarchy of the Old West. Meet the cookie. In the mythology of the American cowboy, we picture young, rugged men on horseback, skilled riders with steady nerves and quick hands. But if you had walked up to any chuckwagon on the trail between 1870 and 1890, the most important person you'd have met probably couldn't ride worth a damn. Might have been pushing 60 years old and could have been nursing any number of physical ailments that made cowboy work impossible. They called him Cookie, sometimes cocinero on Hispanic crews, occasionally old woman, though never to his face if the cowboys were smart. See, becoming a trail cook wasn't usually a first choice. It was often what you did when everything else had been taken from you. Broken down cowboys with busted legs or ruined backs, former Confederate soldiers who came home to find their farms burned out, immigrants who knew kitchens but not saddles, men fleeing something, debts, the law, memories too painful to carry. But here's what's fascinating. Despite starting from positions of apparent weakness, these cooks quickly became the most powerful men on the entire drive. Let me tell you about the unwritten rules of the chuckwagon, because they reveal something profound about human nature and respect. First rule, never ride through the cook's camp. You went around, always around, even if it added a mile to your journey. Why? Because dust settling on food could make the difference between a good meal and a gritty disaster. And Cookie had ways of making your life miserable if you crossed him. Second rule, Cookie's word was law around the wagon. Period. Trail bosses who wouldn't back down from outlaws or angry ranchers deferred to their cook's judgment about meal times, camp locations, and anything related to the chuckwagon. Smart bosses knew that a happy cook meant a well-fed, motivated crew. An angry cook meant trouble that could destroy morale and endanger the entire drive. But perhaps the most telling rule was this: Cookie ate first, and anyone who complained about the food had to do the cooking themselves. Now, that might sound like petty tyranny, but think about what it really meant. These tough, independent men, who wouldn't take orders from anyone, willingly submitted to the authority of someone they might have looked down on in any other context. Why? Because they understood something that modern life has made us forget. Competence creates its own authority. A good trail cook was worth his weight in gold, and not just because he kept the crew fed. He was usually the closest thing to a doctor the cowboys had, mixing remedies for everything from rope burns to dysentery. When wagons broke down, Cookie often had the mechanical skills to fix them. When tensions rose between crew members, he'd defuse situations with humor or strategic meal timing. One old cowboy memoir I found described their cook this way: Old Pete couldn't sit a horse for 5 minutes without falling off, but he could stretch a side of bacon to feed 20 men for a week, doctor a snake bite, and tell stories that would make you forget you were sleeping on the ground with nothing but stars for a roof. These men became the keepers of trail culture. They remembered which waterholes were reliable, which routes avoided trouble, which plants could supplement meals, and which ones would kill you. They were librarians of practical knowledge in a world where the wrong information could mean death. But now comes the part of our story that might surprise you most. What these masters of frontier survival actually cooked with. Because when you're responsible for feeding 20 hungry men for months on end, hundreds of miles from the nearest supply, with limited storage and no refrigeration, your options become, let's call them, creative. The ingredients that sustained America's cowboys were so simple, so basic, that they barely qualified as cuisine at all. Yet from these humble components, Cookie created meals that kept men alive, motivated, and surprisingly satisfied. And the story of those ingredients, the holy trinity of trail food, reveals something beautiful about human adaptability and the alchemy of necessity. But first, let me ask you this. If you had to survive for 4 months with just 3 main ingredients, what would you choose? Keep that in mind, because what the cowboys chose, and why they chose it, might just surprise you. The Holy Trinity: beans, beef, and bread. Imagine opening a chuckwagon's chuck box in 1875. You'd find sacks of flour, bags of coffee, sides of salt pork, maybe some sugar if the outfit was prosperous. But dominating everything else, taking up more space, weighing down the wagon more than any other single item, would be the beans. Hundreds of pounds of dried beans, pinto beans, navy beans, black beans, kidney beans. They came in massive burlap sacks, and they were the foundation of cowboy cuisine. Not because they were delicious, though a hungry man could learn to love them, but because they were perfect. Think about it. Dried beans could last for years without spoiling. They packed incredible nutrition into a small space: protein, fiber, complex carbohydrates, essential minerals. They were cheap to buy in bulk. And most importantly, they could feed a lot of people from a relatively small amount. 1 pound of dried beans, properly prepared, could stretch to feed 4 or 5 hungry cowboys. But here's the catch. Beans are not fast food. They required time, patience, and skill to prepare properly. Cookie would start them soaking the night before, sometimes adding a pinch of baking soda to soften them faster. Then came hours of slow cooking, usually in a large Dutch oven nestled in coals beside the main fire. The cowboys had a saying: beans are the musical fruit. And while that created its own entertainment around the campfire, it also pointed to a serious issue. Improperly cooked beans could lay a crew low with digestive troubles at exactly the wrong time. A skilled cook knew how to prepare them so they were nourishing without being, shall we say, socially disruptive. But beans were just one leg of the tripod. The second essential element was what they generously called beef, though if you were expecting prime steaks, you'd be sorely disappointed. Here's one of history's greatest ironies. Cowboys driving thousands of cattle across the plains almost never ate beef. Why? Because those cattle were the product they were delivering. Killing one for food was like a trucker today eating his cargo. It happened occasionally, when an animal was injured or when they reached the end of a drive, but it was rare. Instead, cowboys lived on salt pork, slabs of pork belly, heavily salted and sometimes smoked, packed in barrels, and designed to last for months without refrigeration. It was tough, salty, and often rancid by the time it was consumed, but it provided essential fats and proteins that beans alone couldn't supply. Cookie had to be an artist with salt pork. Slice it thick and fry it slowly. and you'd get crispy strips that could make anything taste better. Dice it fine and render the fat, and you'd have cooking grease that would last for weeks. Add tiny pieces to beans, and suddenly you had a complete meal instead of just a side dish. But salt pork had its dangers. Too much salt could cause kidney problems and high blood pressure, ailments that plagued many old cowboys. And when the pork went bad, which happened regularly in hot weather, it could poison an entire crew. A good cook knew how to identify spoiled meat and how to salvage the borderline cases with careful preparation. Now, for the third element of our trinity, bread. But not the bread you're thinking of. Fresh bread was a luxury on the trail, possible only when the wagon stayed put for a day or more and conditions were perfect. Most of the time, cowboys ate hardtack, a mixture of flour, water, and salt, baked until it had the consistency of a brick and about as much flavor. Hardtack could last for years without spoiling. It provided carbohydrates and could be eaten dry, soaked in coffee, or crumbled into stews. But it was also hard enough to break teeth, infested with weevils more often than not, and about as appetizing as chewing on cardboard. The lucky crews had a cook who maintained a sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast that could transform simple flour and water into actual bread. But keeping sourdough alive on the trail was like caring for a temperamental pet. It had to be fed regularly with flour and water, kept at the right temperature, protected from extreme heat and cold. Cookie might sleep with the sourdough crock wrapped in blankets next to his bedroll on cold nights. He'd guard it jealously, because losing the starter meant months of hardtack instead of soft, tangy sourdough biscuits that could make even the toughest cowboy feel human again. But here's what strikes me most about this trinity of trail food. It wasn't really about the ingredients at all. It was about transformation. In the hands of a skilled cook, these humble materials became something greater than the sum of their parts. Beans, salt pork, and flour became comfort, community, and hope served in tin plates around a dying fire under an endless sky. And yet, there was something else that mattered even more than food to these men, something that could make or break a cattle drive, that could determine whether a crew stayed together or fell apart. That was more precious than water in some situations, something that connected them to civilization and reminded them they were still human. Can you guess what it was? Here's a hint. It was the first thing Cookie prepared every morning, often in complete darkness, and the last thing the cowboys tasted before sleep. It was their ritual, their religion, their liquid salvation. Coffee, the cowboys' liquid salvation. If beans were the foundation of cowboy cuisine, coffee was its soul. No substance on the frontier carried more emotional weight, created more fierce loyalty, or caused more arguments than the dark brew that emerged from Cookie's battered coffee pot each morning. But this wasn't coffee as you know it. This was something else entirely. A bitter black concoction strong enough to dissolve horseshoes and potent enough to wake the dead. Cowboys called it six-shooter coffee because it was supposedly strong enough to float a pistol. One trail cook bragged that his coffee was so powerful it could revive a snake with its back broke in 3 places. The preparation ritual began before dawn, often around 3 in the morning, when Cookie would rise in the darkness and build up the fire into a large enamel-ware pot. Usually dented from years of trail use, he'd throw handfuls of ground coffee. No measuring, no precision, just experience and instinct. One old recipe called for a pound of coffee to a gallon of water, and if that ain't strong enough, add more coffee. But here's where it gets interesting. There was no filter, no strainer, nothing to separate the grounds from the liquid. The coffee was simply boiled, grounds and all, until it reached the desired strength, which was usually just short of toxic. To settle the grounds, Cookie might add a dash of cold water, a raw egg, or sometimes just bang the pot with a spoon and hope for the best. The result was a beverage that could strip paint and cure insomnia permanently. One cowboy described it as strong enough to tan leather and bitter enough to make a preacher cuss. Another said it was like drinking liquid barbed wire that had been aged in a tobacco spittoon. And yet, they craved it. Coffee wasn't just caffeine to these men, it was ceremony, comfort, and connection. It was the first civilized thing they tasted each morning, and often the only warm meal they'd have all day. Around that coffee pot, hierarchies dissolved. The trail boss drank alongside the newest hand, and for a few minutes, they were just men sharing warmth against the vastness of the frontier. The coffee ritual also revealed the cook's true power. A pot of good coffee could smooth over conflicts, boost morale, and create loyalty that lasted for years. But weak coffee, or worse yet, no coffee at all, could cause near mutiny. Cowboys would work through broken bones and fever, but mess with their coffee, and you'd have a revolt on your hands. One memoir tells of a drive where the cook ran out of coffee beans still 50 miles from the nearest town. The crew nearly abandoned the cattle right there. Finally, the trail boss sent 2 riders racing ahead to buy emergency supplies, while the rest of the men grumbled and threatened to quit. When those riders returned with fresh coffee, the celebration lasted all night. Cookie's coffee skills became legendary among crews. Some cooks developed secret techniques, adding a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness, throwing in cinnamon bark for flavor, or aging the grounds in whiskey barrels for special occasions. The best cooks could make decent coffee from beans that had gone stale, water that was barely potable, and equipment that belonged in a museum. But coffee presented its own challenges on the trail. Green coffee beans lasted longer than roasted ones, but they had to be roasted over an open fire, easy to burn, impossible to do evenly. Water quality varied wildly, from sweet spring water that made perfect coffee to alkaline pond water that turned the brew into something resembling medicine. And coffee was expensive, a real luxury that had to be rationed carefully on longer drives. During the Civil War, when real coffee became scarce, people made substitutes from chicory, acorns, or roasted grain. Cowboys who had endured those dark years never took real coffee for granted again. They'd pay premium prices for quality beans and guard their coffee supplies like treasure. But coffee was more than just a drink. It was a social institution. The evening coffee ritual brought the crew together after a hard day. Men would linger around the pot, sharing stories, planning the next day's route, settling disputes, or just enjoying a few minutes of peace. Cookie's coffee pot became the center of frontier democracy, where decisions were discussed and consensus was built. And there was etiquette around coffee that outsiders never understood. You never poured the last cup without making a fresh pot. You never complained about the coffee within earshot of the cook. That was asking for trouble. And you always offered to share with visitors, even if you were down to your last few beans. Now, with beans providing substance, salt pork adding flavor and fat, flour creating bread, and coffee maintaining sanity, you might think we've covered cowboy cuisine. But you'd be missing some of the most interesting parts of the story, because Cookie had to be more than just a cook. He had to be a forager, an herbalist, a hunter, and sometimes a magician, creating variety and nutrition from whatever the frontier provided. And that's where our tale takes another fascinating turn, because the cowboys who ventured into different regions of the West encountered flavors, techniques, and ingredients that would fundamentally change American cuisine forever. The influence of Mexican cooking, the integration of Native American knowledge, the adaptation to local conditions, all of this created a fusion cuisine decades before that term was ever invented. But first, let me paint you a picture of what a typical day actually looked like around that chuckwagon, because the rhythm of meals shaped everything else about trail life. A day in the life, dawn to dusk, around the chuckwagon. The day began in darkness so complete you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Around 3 in the morning, While the cowboys still slept in their bedrolls and the cattle dozed standing up, Cookie would rise without fanfare or alarm clock. His internal timepiece, honed by years of trail life, never failed him. The first sound the sleeping camp would hear was the scrape of a shovel stirring coals back to life, followed by the gentle clank of metal on metal as Cookie arranged his cooking gear. There was an art to this morning routine. How to build up the fire without creating too much light or smoke. How to start coffee without waking the crew too early. How to begin breakfast preparations in almost total darkness. By 3:30, the coffee pot was burbling and that rich, bitter aroma would begin drifting across the camp. Experienced cowboys knew this smell meant they had about 30 minutes before Cookie's voice would cut through the morning silence with the call that started every day. "Come and get it, or I'll throw it out." But breakfast wasn't a leisurely affair. Cowboys had exactly 15 minutes to gulp down their food, drain their coffee cups, and prepare for the day. The cattle were restless in the early morning, sensing the coming activity, and every minute of daylight was precious on the trail. What did breakfast look like? Picture tin plates filled with beans that had been slow cooking all night, strips of fried salt pork still sizzling from the pan, and if they were lucky, sourdough biscuits hot enough to burn your fingers. Coffee came black and strong enough to dissolve spurs, served in battered tin cups that had seen more miles than most people. Cookie served from the back of the chuckwagon, his domain organized with military precision. Every pot, pan, and utensil had its place, and woe to the cowboy who interfered with this system. Smart hands knew to grab their food quickly and move away, giving Cookie room to work and clean. By 4:30, the crew was mounted and moving, but Cookie's day was just beginning. He had to clean up breakfast, pack everything securely for travel, harness the team, and somehow stay ahead of the moving herd to reach the next camp location by afternoon. The chuckwagon typically traveled parallel to the main trail, taking shortcuts when possible, but always arriving at the designated camping spot with enough time to set up for the evening meal. Midday brought the greatest challenge for everyone involved: how to keep 20 hungry men functional during the long, hot hours between breakfast and dinner. There was no lunch break on a cattle drive, no stopping for a picnic. Cowboys ate in the saddle, if they ate at all. Cookie had prepared for this. Before leaving morning camp, he'd filled small cloth sacks with what cowboys called riding food: cold leftover biscuits, strips of jerky, maybe some dried fruit if supplies allowed. Each cowboy carried his own emergency rations, but these were supplements, not meals. The real sustenance had to last from dawn until evening. Water was always the critical factor during these long days. Cowboys carried canteens, but water was precious and had to be rationed carefully. Cookie knew every reliable water source along the major trails, but weather, seasons, and cattle ahead of them could make even reliable sources unreliable. When water was scarce, meals had to be adapted. Beans needed less water if they'd been pre-soaked longer. Coffee could be made stronger with less liquid. Stews could be thickened to stretch ingredients. Cookie's knowledge of water management often meant the difference between a successful drive and a disaster. But the real magic happened in the evening, when the herd was settled for the night and the crew could finally gather around the chuckwagon for their main meal of the day. This wasn't just dinner. It was the social center of trail life, the time when the scattered crew became a community again. Cookie had been working toward this moment all day. The evening meal required his most careful planning and his greatest skill. With limited ingredients and equipment, he had to create something that would satisfy 20 exhausted, hungry men and give them the energy to face another day. The menu was predictable, but somehow never boring. Beans formed the foundation, always beans, prepared differently each night to create the illusion of variety. Sometimes they were thick and stew-like, simmered with pieces of salt pork until the meat fell apart. Sometimes they're very sharp, extended with water and wild onions to feed extra mouths. Sometimes they were baked slowly in Dutch ovens buried in coals, emerging crusty on top and creamy underneath. Alongside the beans came bread, in whatever form Cookie could manage. Fresh biscuits were the gold standard, light, fluffy, and still warm from the Dutch oven. But more often it was cornbread, dense and filling, made with water instead of milk and sweetened with molasses if they were lucky. Hardtack appeared when time or conditions made fresh bread impossible. The salt pork might be fried crisp and served in strips, or diced and rendered into cooking fat, or thrown into a stew with whatever vegetables Cookie had managed to gather during the day. And there would be coffee. Always. Coffee. Pot after pot of it, as the men lingered around the fire. This evening, gathering served purposes beyond nutrition. It was when the trail boss shared plans for the next day, when disputes were settled, when news was exchanged with passing travelers. It was when someone might pull out a harmonica or guitar, when stories were told and retold, when the loneliness of the trail was temporarily forgotten. Cookie presided over all of this like a benevolent monarch. He served the food, monitored the conversation, intervened when tempers flared, and somehow managed to keep 20 different personalities functioning as a team. His coffee pot was the center of frontier democracy, and his opinion on everything from weather to cattle prices carried enormous weight. But don't romanticize this scene too much. These evening meals also revealed the harsh realities of trail life. Men ate with unwashed hands from tin plates that never got properly clean. Flies swarmed around the food. Dust seasoned everything. The beans were often overcooked or undercooked, the meat was frequently rancid, and the coffee could strip paint. Yet, somehow, in the gathering darkness under an endless canopy of stars, with the cattle lowing softly in the distance and a fire crackling warmth against the prairie wind, these simple meals became something magical. They became home, community, and hope, served on battered tin plates. As the evening wound down and the men rolled out their bedrolls, Cookie would be planning the next day, checking supplies, calculating distances to the next water source. His day ended as it began, in solitary preparation for the needs of others. But what happened when Mother Nature decided to test these carefully planned routines? When storms rolled across the prairie, when water sources dried up, when the very elements seemed determined to make survival impossible. That's when Cookie's true genius revealed itself, because feeding a crew under perfect conditions was one thing. Keeping them alive when everything went wrong, that was the mark of a master. Fighting the elements. When nature declared war, nothing tested a trail cook's skills like weather that seemed designed by some malevolent force specifically to make outdoor cooking impossible. Picture Cookie at 4 a.m, trying to start a fire in wind gusts that could knock a man sideways, with rain driving horizontally across the prairie, turning everything into a muddy soup that sucked at your boots and made dry kindling a fantasy. These weren't gentle spring showers or mild summer breezes. This was frontier weather, violent, unpredictable, and utterly unforgiving. Thunderstorms would explode out of clear skies with winds that could flip a chuckwagon and hail that could kill a steer. Blizzards would bury camps under 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours. And dust storms, those choking, blinding walls of dirt, could turn day into night and make breathing an act of will. But Cookie had to feed the crew regardless of what nature threw at him. There were no restaurants to retreat to, no delivery services, no backup plans. The men had to eat, or they couldn't work. And if they couldn't work, the drive failed. Let me tell you about dust storms, because they were perhaps the most insidious challenge Cookie faced. You'd see them coming from miles away, a brown wall reaching from earth to sky, rolling across the prairie like the end of the world. Smart cooks would try to get a meal prepared before the storm hit, but that wasn't always possible. When dust storms struck during meal preparation, Everything had to be covered instantly. Food, cookware, water barrels, anything exposed would be contaminated by dirt so fine it penetrated everywhere. Cookie would throw wet canvas over the chuck box, wrap pots in damp cloths, and somehow try to maintain a cooking fire that the wind wanted to scatter to the four corners of creation. The cowboys would hunker down with bandanas over their faces, but they still had to eat. Cookie learned to cook dust meals. Foods that could be prepared and served quickly, eaten with heads ducked and eyes closed. Thick stews that wouldn't be ruined by a layer of dirt. Coffee so strong that a little grit wouldn't affect the taste. Biscuits baked in tightly covered Dutch ovens. But dust was nothing compared to rain. Prairie thunderstorms could drop inches of water in minutes, turning the cooking area into a quagmire and making fire maintenance nearly impossible. Cookie had to learn the art of cooking in the rain, how to angle Dutch ovens to keep water out, how to maintain coals under a makeshift shelter, how to serve hot food when everything was soaking wet. Some cooks developed elaborate canvas systems, tarps and lean-tos that could be erected quickly when storms threatened. Others learned to cook in relays, preparing food in short bursts between downpours. The best cooks seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to sense weather changes and adjust their timing accordingly. Winter brought its own special torments. Imagine trying to prepare breakfast when the temperature was 20 below zero, when water froze in the pot before it could boil, when your hands went numb after minutes of exposure. Cookie wore gloves, but gloves made fine work impossible. He'd warm his hands over the fire, work quickly with bare fingers, then warm them again. A constant cycle that made every task take twice as long. Cold weather also changed the food itself. Beans took longer to cook in frigid temperatures. Coffee wouldn't stay hot for more than a few minutes after pouring. Bread dough wouldn't rise properly, and everything had to be kept from freezing. Flour turned to concrete, salt pork became unsliceable, and even coffee beans could crack an extreme cold. But perhaps the greatest weather-related challenge was water, or the lack of it. When sources dried up or became contaminated, Cookie had to adapt every recipe to use less liquid. Beans that normally required hours of boiling had to be cooked in stages, with water saved and reused. Coffee became a luxury reserved for morning and evening. Washing dishes became impossible, creating sanitation problems that could make the whole crew sick. I found one account of a drive where they went 4 days without finding good water. Cookie managed to keep the crew fed by using morning dew collected on canvas, muddy pond water boiled and strained through cloth, and even moisture wrung from wet clothes. The coffee during that stretch was described as looking like swamp water and tasting worse. But it was hot and wet, and that was enough. During one particularly brutal drought, a cook named Alkali Pete became legendary for his ability to make even the worst water drinkable. Alkaline water, common in many parts of the West, was so mineral heavy it could make coffee taste like medicine and cause severe digestive problems. Pete developed a technique using burnt biscuit crumbs as a crude filter, somehow managing to remove enough minerals to make the water tolerable. But weather wasn't just about discomfort. It could be deadly. Lightning, strikes during thunderstorms were a constant threat. Floods could wash away entire camps. Hypothermia claimed lives during unexpected blizzards, and Cookie, working around open flames in all conditions, faced unique dangers. One cook lost 3 fingers when lightning struck a metal pot he was stirring. Another was found frozen to death beside his morning fire, apparently overcome by carbon monoxide from burning green wood in a windless canyon. These weren't romantic adventures. They were life and death struggles against forces that could kill without warning. Yet somehow, the good cooks adapted to everything nature threw at them. They developed an almost mystical understanding of weather patterns, able to sense approaching storms hours before they arrived. They learned to read the sky, the wind, the behavior of animals. They could prepare for changes that city dwellers wouldn't notice until they were already happening, and their adaptations became part of cowboy culture. Recipes were modified for different conditions. Cooking techniques were passed down from one cookie to the next. Equipment was redesigned based on hard-won experience. The entire system of trail cooking evolved to meet the challenges of an unforgiving environment. But here's what strikes me most about these struggles with the elements. They revealed something profound about human resilience and adaptation. When everything went wrong, when the very air seemed hostile, and the earth itself seemed determined to defeat them, Cookie and his crew found ways to survive. Not just survive, to maintain morale, to create community, to find moments of comfort, and even joy in the midst of hardship. That said, all the skill and adaptation in the world couldn't overcome one fundamental limitation of trail life. The cowboys weren't just dealing with challenging conditions and limited ingredients. They were also dealing with the long-term health consequences of a diet that, while sufficient for short-term survival, was nutritionally incomplete in ways that would eventually exact a terrible price. The price of the trail: health, hardship, and hidden costs. If you examine photographs of cowboys from the 1880s and 1890s, the real ones, not the Hollywood versions, you'll notice something disturbing. These men, often still in their 30s and 40s, look decades older than their years. Their faces are weathered beyond their age. Their postures suggest chronic pain, and their eyes carry a weariness that speaks of bodies pushed beyond sustainable limits. The trail diet, while adequate for short-term survival, extracted a brutal toll over time. Beans, salt pork, flour, and coffee might keep a man functioning for months, but they couldn't provide everything the human body needed to thrive. The absence of fresh fruits and vegetables meant scurvy was a constant threat on longer drives. This disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, began subtly with fatigue and joint pain, then progressed to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death if left untreated. Cookie became the crew's unofficial doctor partly out of necessity, but partly because he was often the first to notice the early signs of nutritional deficiency. He'd watch for bleeding gums when the men drank their morning coffee, listen for complaints of joint pain, monitor energy levels as drives wore on. Smart cooks learned to recognize and treat scurvy with whatever vitamin C sources they could find on the prairie. Wild onions, when available, became precious medicine. Rose hips, gathered in autumn, could be dried and stored for months. Some cooks learned from Native Americans that certain pine needle teas could ward off scurvy, though getting cowboys to drink tree tea required considerable persuasion and often outright deception. But scurvy was just one problem. The heavy salt content in preserved pork caused kidney problems and high blood pressure that would plague former cowboys for the rest of their lives. The monotonous diet led to chronic constipation, then violent bouts of dysentery, when the crew finally reached towns with different food options. Dental problems were epidemic, not just from the hardtack that could crack teeth, but from the complete absence of foods that promoted oral health. One cowboy memoir I discovered described men in their 40s who had lost most of their teeth, not from bar fights or accidents, but from years of nutritional deficiency and poor oral hygiene. Old Jake could gum a biscuit faster than most men could chew one, the author wrote. But watching him try to eat an apple was like watching a baby bird trying to crack a walnut. The psychological toll was equally severe, though less understood at the time. Months of isolation, monotonous food, and constant stress led to what we'd now recognize as depression and anxiety disorders. Cowboys developed strange food obsessions and aversions. Some became unable to eat beans after years on the trail. Others craved specific foods with an intensity that bordered on madness. I found accounts of trail-hardened men breaking down in tears at the sight of fresh vegetables in frontier towns. One veteran cowboy reportedly spent his entire month's wages on oranges in Kansas City, eating them until he made himself violently ill, simply because he hadn't tasted citrus in over a year. Cookie himself wasn't immune to these problems. In fact, cooks often suffered more than the cowboys because they tasted food constantly throughout the day, testing, seasoning, adjusting. This constant exposure to the same limited ingredients, combined with irregular eating schedules and the stress of feeding others, created unique health challenges. Many trail cooks developed what they called cook's stomach, chronic digestive problems caused by eating too much salted and preserved food, irregular meal times, and the stress of constant responsibility. Some became alcoholics, using whiskey to numb the pain of chronic health issues. Others developed food-related superstitions and compulsions that their crews learned to work around. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of trail life was how it aged men prematurely and permanently. The combination of poor nutrition, extreme weather exposure, physical stress, and inadequate medical care meant that many cowboys were essentially disabled by their 40s. Arthritis from sleeping on the ground in all weather, respiratory problems from breathing dust for months at a time, digestive issues that would plague them for life. One study of Civil War veterans who became cowboys found that their life expectancy was significantly lower than soldiers who returned to farming or city work. The trail lifestyle that seemed to promise freedom and adventure often delivered chronic pain and early death instead. Cookie watched all of this happen to the men he fed. He saw strong young cowboys gradually worn down by the accumulation of small deprivations and hardships. And there was little he could do about it with the tools and knowledge available to him. But the best cooks didn't give up trying. They became students of frontier medicine, learning which plants could treat which ailments. They developed techniques for making nutritionally poor food more digestible and palatable. They created traditions and rituals around meals that provided psychological comfort, even when physical comfort was impossible. Some cooks became legendary for their healing skills. Doc Harrison, who worked the Chisholm Trail in the 1870s, was said to cure everything from snakebite to saddle sores with various concoctions brewed in his coffee pot. Whether his remedies actually worked or whether his confident manner provided a placebo effect, his crews stayed healthier than most, and Cookie learned to adapt recipes for sick men. When dysentery struck a crew, he'd prepare rice water and weak broths until stomachs could handle solid food again. For men with scurvy, he'd make tonics from whatever plant sources he could find. For the depressed and homesick, he'd create special treats, maybe molasses candy or a rare dessert that could lift spirits if only temporarily. The economic costs of poor trail nutrition were staggering, though rarely calculated at the time. Cowboys who couldn't work due to illness had to be replaced or compensated. Drives were delayed when too many men fell sick simultaneously. Some outfits had to abandon cattle drives entirely when health problems became overwhelming. Smart trail bosses learned to invest in better food and more skilled cooks, not out of kindness, but because it made economic sense. A drive that reached its destination with healthy, motivated cowboys could command better prices and retain experienced hands for future drives. Penny pinching on food often proved more expensive than paying for quality ingredients and skilled preparation. But even the best trail nutrition was limited by the technology and knowledge of the time. There was no understanding of vitamins and minerals, no knowledge of balanced nutrition, no effective food preservation beyond salting and smoking. Cookie worked with tools that were barely adequate and knowledge that was mostly folklore and experience. What's remarkable is how much they accomplished despite these limitations. Trail cooks developed techniques that kept men functioning under conditions that would challenge modern expedition planners. They created systems for managing limited resources, maintaining food safety without refrigeration, and providing psychological comfort through food preparation and presentation. Yet, as successful as these systems were for short-term survival, they couldn't overcome the fundamental limitations of frontier life. The human cost of the cattle drive era was enormous, paid in chronic illness, premature aging, and lives cut short by the accumulated effects of hardship. But the story doesn't end with decline and suffering, because as the great cattle drives drew to a close in the 1880s and 1890s, the knowledge and techniques developed by trail cooks didn't disappear. Instead, they evolved and adapted to new circumstances, creating a lasting influence on American food culture that continues to this day. The question is, how did these humble trail meals, born of necessity and limitation, manage to transform American cuisine and create food traditions that would outlast the frontier itself? The end of an era, rails, wires, and the closing of the range. By 1885, the great age of cattle drives was already fading into memory. The Transcontinental Railroad had spawned dozens of branch lines reaching into previously remote areas. Barbed wire was carving the open range into private parcels, and most importantly, refrigerated railroad cars were making it possible to ship fresh beef directly from local slaughterhouses to eastern markets. The economic foundation that had created the cattle drive era, the need to move livestock hundreds of miles to reach rail transportation, was rapidly disappearing. What had once required months of dangerous travel across open country could now be accomplished in days on steel rails. But the end didn't come all at once. The last great drives continued into the 1890s, and some smaller operations persisted well into the 20th century. Cookie and his chuckwagon adapted to these changing times, becoming less central to large-scale cattle operations, but more important to smaller ranching communities. Instead of feeding crews for months-long drives, cooks found themselves supporting seasonal ranch work, roundups, branding operations, fence construction. The chuckwagon became a mobile base camp for crews working far from the main ranch house, still essential but operating in a fundamentally different context. Ranch cooking evolved differently than trail cooking had. With permanent bases and regular supply runs, cooks could experiment with ingredients that had been impossible on the trail. Fresh vegetables from ranch gardens, dairy products from ranch cattle, wild game, hunted locally, rather than preserved meat carried for months. But the basic techniques developed during the trail drive era persisted. Dutch oven cooking, sourdough bread making, the art of stretching simple ingredients into satisfying meals. All of these skills transferred directly from trail to ranch kitchen. Cookie's knowledge became the foundation for a distinctly Western approach to cooking that valued practicality, resourcefulness, and the ability to feed large groups efficiently. Some former trail cooks found work in the growing frontier towns, opening restaurants and boarding houses where their skills with large-scale economical cooking were highly valued. Others became ranch cooks, settling into permanent positions where they could apply their expertise to a more stable lifestyle. The chuckwagon itself evolved from a necessity to a tradition. By the early 1900s, many ranches maintained chuckwagons not because they were required for daily operations, but because they represented an important part of ranch culture and identity. Seasonal roundups and special events continued to center around the mobile kitchen that had once been the heart of trail life. But something else was happening during this transition period. The mythology of the cowboy era was beginning to take shape, and food played a crucial role in that mythologizing process. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows, which began in the 1880s, featured not just riding and roping demonstrations, but also romanticized portrayals of chuckwagon life. Audiences in eastern cities watched staged reenactments of trail meals, complete with cowboys gathered around campfires, eating from tin plates and drinking coffee from battered cups. These performances created an idealized version of cowboy cuisine that bore only a passing resemblance to the harsh realities we've been exploring. The beans were perfectly seasoned, the coffee was strong but never bitter, and the cowboys seemed to genuinely enjoy their simple fare rather than merely enduring it. Dime novels and early Western stories further romanticized trail food, describing hearty meals shared around crackling campfires under starlit skies. Authors who had never been within 1,000 miles of a cattle drive wrote lovingly of sourdough biscuits and cowboy coffee, creating a mythology that would influence American ideas about Western cuisine for generations. By the 1920s and 1930s, as Hollywood began producing Western films, this romanticized version of cowboy cooking became firmly embedded in popular culture. Movie cowboys never seemed to suffer from dysentery or scurvy. Their coffee was always perfect. Their beans never caused digestive distress. And their meals around the campfire were occasions for camaraderie rather than mere survival. This mythology had real consequences for how Americans understood their history and their cuisine. The harsh realities of trail nutrition were forgotten in favor of a nostalgic fantasy of simple, honest food prepared over open fires. The genuine suffering and ingenuity of trail cooks was transformed into a romantic ideal of self-sufficient masculinity. But underneath the mythology, the practical techniques and cultural patterns developed during the trail drive era continued to influence American food culture in profound ways. The emphasis on simple, filling meals that could be prepared with minimal equipment. The tradition of communal eating around a central cooking area. The valorization of cooks who could create satisfying meals from humble ingredients. These patterns spread far beyond ranching communities. Church suppers, community gatherings, and family reunions across the American West adopted modified versions of chuckwagon traditions. Large-scale outdoor cooking, the use of Dutch ovens and cast-iron equipment, and the preference for simple, hearty fare all reflected the influence of trail cooking culture. Even urban restaurants began incorporating cowboy themes and dishes, though their versions bore little resemblance to authentic trail food. Ranch style became a marketing term applied to everything from salad dressing to television shows, trading on the mythological association of Western food with authenticity and masculinity. Meanwhile, the actual techniques and knowledge developed by trail cooks found new applications in camping, scouting, and outdoor recreation. The Boy Scout movement, founded in 1907, explicitly drew on frontier traditions of outdoor cooking and self-sufficiency. Chuckwagon cooking techniques were taught to generations of young people as practical skills for outdoor adventure. But, perhaps most importantly, the cultural values embedded in chuckwagon traditions, resourcefulness, adaptability, the ability to create community around shared meals, became part of a broader American identity that extended far beyond the geographic boundaries of the old frontier. The question that fascinated me as I researched this story was, how do we separate the mythology from the reality? How do we honor the genuine achievements and sacrifices of trail cooks while acknowledging the harsh realities they faced? And what lessons from their experience remain relevant in our modern world of abundant food and endless culinary options? Modern remembrance, keeping the flame alive. Drive through almost any town in the American West today, and you'll likely see signs advertising chuckwagon dinners or authentic cowboy cuisine. Pull into these establishments, and you'll find air-conditioned dining rooms serving prime rib, loaded baked potatoes, and desserts that would have been unimaginable to a trail cook, all while waitresses in cowboy hats serve sweet tea in mason jars and recorded country music plays in the background. It's entertainment, of course, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it bears about as much resemblance to actual chuckwagon cooking as a theme park bears to the real frontier. The question that interests me is, what happened to the authentic traditions? Where did the real knowledge go? The answer is both heartening and complex. While commercial cowboy cuisine drifted toward fantasy, the actual techniques and traditions of chuckwagon cooking found new life in unexpected places. Competitive chuckwagon cooking emerged in the mid-20th century as ranching communities sought to preserve and celebrate their heritage. These competitions, held across the American West, feature teams using authentic equipment and traditional techniques to prepare meals that would be recognizable to cookie from 1875. I attended one of these competitions in Fort Worth, Texas, and what I witnessed was remarkable. Dozens of teams, each with period-authentic chuckwagons, competed to prepare the best beans, the best sourdough biscuits, the best camp coffee. No modern conveniences were allowed. No propane, no electric grinders, no contemporary cookware, just cast iron, wood fires, and techniques passed down through generations. The competitors weren't professional chefs or culinary school graduates. They were ranchers, cowboys, and enthusiasts who had learned these skills from fathers and grandfathers who had actually worked cattle drives. The knowledge had survived, transmitted through family lines and working ranch communities, preserved not as museum pieces, but as living traditions. What struck me most about these competitions was the seriousness with which participants approached historical accuracy. They researched recipes from period sources, studied photographs of authentic chuckwagons, and consulted with food historians to ensure their techniques were genuinely representative of trail cooking methods. But they also adapted and improved on traditional methods in ways that Cookie would have appreciated. Better understanding of food safety allowed them to serve beans that were both authentic and safe. Modern knowledge of nutrition helped them supplement traditional recipes with ingredients that addressed the health problems that had plagued trail cooks. The judging criteria for these competitions reveals what contemporary practitioners value most about chuckwagon traditions: functionality, authenticity, and the ability to feed large groups efficiently. Presentation matters, but not as much as whether the food actually tastes good and whether the cooking methods reflect genuine historical practice. Beyond formal competitions, chuckwagon cooking has found new life in other contexts. Boy Scout camps across the West teach Dutch oven cooking as a standard skill. Church groups use chuckwagon methods for large outdoor gatherings. Military and law enforcement training programs incorporate wilderness cooking techniques that derive directly from trail cook traditions. But perhaps the most interesting modern application of chuckwagon principles has been in high-end restaurant kitchens, where chefs have discovered that the constraints that shaped trail cooking, limited ingredients, simple equipment, emphasis on technique over technology, can produce remarkably sophisticated results. Several prominent chefs have opened restaurants explicitly based on chuckwagon principles, using only cast iron cookware, wood fires, and ingredients that would have been available to frontier cooks. These restaurants aren't theme parks or tourist attractions. They're serious culinary enterprises that demonstrate how much can be accomplished with minimal resources when technique and knowledge are applied skillfully. The survival and evolution of chuckwagon traditions also reflects broader cultural movements. The slow food movement, farm-to-table dining, and renewed interest in traditional food preparation methods. In an era of processed foods and industrial agriculture, the chuckwagon represents values that many people find appealing: simplicity, authenticity, direct connection between cook and ingredients. But there's also a darker side to the modern romanticization of cowboy cuisine. The harsh realities we've explored, the health consequences of poor nutrition, the exploitation of cooks' labor, the environmental and social costs of the cattle industry, are often glossed over in favor of nostalgic fantasy. Modern chuckwagon enthusiasts generally acknowledge these realities while still celebrating the genuine achievements of trail cooks. They understand that romantic mythology and historical accuracy can coexist, each serving different cultural needs. What's been lost, though, is the context that gave chuckwagon cooking its meaning. Cookie's skills were impressive not because they produced gourmet meals, but because they kept men alive under conditions that would challenge modern survival experts. His authority came not from culinary training, but from demonstrated competence under extreme pressure. Modern practitioners of chuckwagon cooking don't face these life-and-death challenges. Their skills are impressive, but they're performing rather than surviving. This doesn't diminish their achievements, but it changes the meaning of what they do. Perhaps the most valuable legacy of chuckwagon traditions isn't specific recipes or techniques, but the broader lessons about resourcefulness, adaptation, and the power of shared meals to create community. These lessons remain relevant in our modern world, even if the specific challenges that created them have largely disappeared. As I've researched and written about chuckwagon cooking, I've been struck by how much we can learn from Cookie's approach to his work. He understood that feeding people was about more than just nutrition. It was about morale, community, and hope. He knew that simple ingredients, skillfully prepared and shared with others, could provide comfort that went far beyond mere sustenance. In our modern world of abundant food choices and endless culinary options, there's something both humbling and inspiring about the achievements of men who created satisfying, nourishing meals from beans, salt pork, and flour. They remind us that cooking is not primarily about exotic ingredients or sophisticated equipment, but about understanding the fundamental relationships between fire, food, and human need. And maybe that's the real legacy of the chuckwagon era, not the romantic mythology of cowboys gathered around campfires, but the practical demonstration that simple food, skillfully prepared and shared with others, can sustain not just the body, but the spirit as well. The chuckwagon tradition survives because it represents something we recognize as valuable: the ability to create abundance from scarcity, community from isolation, and hope from hardship. These are lessons that remain relevant regardless of how much our food systems have changed. Lessons from the trail. What Cookie can teach us today. As we reach the end of our journey through the culinary landscape of the American frontier, I find myself thinking about what lessons from Cookie's world might still matter in our age of food delivery apps and celebrity chefs, of molecular gastronomy and Instagram-worthy presentations. On the surface, it might seem like there's nothing trail cooking can teach us. We live in an era of unprecedented food abundance, where ingredients from around the world are available at any time of year, where professional-grade equipment is accessible to home cooks, where any recipe imaginable can be found online with a few keystrokes. And yet, the more I've learned about chuckwagon cooking, the more I've come to believe that Cookie understood something fundamental about food and human nature that we're in danger of forgetting. First, he understood that the primary purpose of cooking isn't to impress or to showcase technique. It's to nourish and sustain. Every decision Cookie made, from ingredient selection to cooking methods to meal timing, was driven by a simple question: will this help the men I'm responsible for do their jobs and stay healthy? In our modern food culture, where presentation often seems to matter more than nutrition and where social media has turned every meal into a potential performance, there's something refreshing about Cookie's relentless focus on function over form. His beans might not have looked elegant, but they kept cowboys working for months at a time. Second, Cookie mastered the art of creating variety and satisfaction from a limited palette of ingredients. With just beans, flour, salt pork, and whatever he could forage, he managed to create meals that men actually looked forward to. This required not just technical skill, but creativity and deep understanding of how flavors combine and complement each other. Modern home cooks, facing pantries full of ingredients but limited time and energy, might learn from Cookie's approach. Instead of trying to master hundreds of different dishes, what if we focused on truly understanding a smaller number of versatile ingredients and techniques? Third, Cookie understood the social and psychological dimensions of food in ways that extended far beyond mere nutrition. He knew that the evening meal was about more than calories. It was about community, morale, and hope. The rituals he created around food service, the traditions he maintained, the atmosphere he fostered around the chuckwagon, all served purposes that had nothing to do with protein and carbohydrates. In our modern world, where many people eat alone while staring at screens, where family dinners have become rare luxuries rather than daily traditions, Cookie's emphasis on communal eating and food as a social institution feels both nostalgic and necessary. Fourth, Cookie was a master of adaptation and resourcefulness. When ingredients ran low, he adjusted recipes. When weather made normal cooking impossible, he found alternative methods. When water was scarce or contaminated, he developed workarounds. His entire approach to cooking was based on flexibility and problem-solving rather than rigid adherence to recipes. This adaptability seems increasingly valuable in our modern world. Climate change, supply chain disruptions, economic uncertainty, all of these challenges require the kind of flexible, resourceful approach that Cookie embodied. His example suggests that the best way to prepare for an uncertain future might not be stockpiling exotic ingredients, but mastering fundamental techniques that can be adapted to changing circumstances. Fifth, Cookie understood that simple food, prepared well, can be profoundly satisfying. His best meals weren't complex or sophisticated. They were basic ingredients elevated through skillful preparation and attention to detail. A pot of beans that had simmered all day, developing deep flavors and perfect texture. Coffee brewed with precision and served at exactly the right strength. Sourdough biscuits, light and tangy, made from a starter carefully maintained over months of travel. In our era of culinary complexity, where restaurants compete to create ever more elaborate dishes and home cooks feel pressure to master complicated techniques, Cookie's example suggests that mastery of simple preparations might be more valuable than dabbling in countless complicated recipes. But, perhaps, most importantly, Cookie understood that cooking is ultimately an act of care. Care for the people we feed, care for the ingredients we use, care for the traditions we inherit and pass on. His authority came not from credentials or formal training, but from demonstrated commitment to the well-being of others. This understanding of cooking as caregiving rather than performance might be Cookie's most important lesson for our modern world. In an era where food has become increasingly industrialized and commercialized, where many people have become disconnected from the sources of their food and the processes that bring it to their tables, Cookie's example reminds us that cooking is fundamentally about human relationships. Of course, we can't and shouldn't try to return to the conditions that shaped Cookie's world. The health costs of the trail diet were enormous. The social isolation was destructive, and the environmental impacts of the cattle industry were devastating. We can honor Cookie's achievements while acknowledging the limitations and problems of the system he worked within. But we can learn from his approach. We can embrace his resourcefulness while applying it to ingredients and techniques that serve modern nutritional needs. We can adopt his focus on community and care while using our modern understanding of food safety and nutrition. We can appreciate his mastery of simple techniques while applying those skills to ingredients that would have been unimaginable in his time. Most importantly, we can remember that the best cooking, whether it happens in a five-star restaurant or around a campfire, whether it uses exotic ingredients or simple staples, is always ultimately about nourishing others and creating connections between people. As the stars emerge overhead, just as they did for cowboys gathered around chuckwagons more than a century ago, we're reminded that some things don't change. People still need food, community, and care. They still find comfort in shared meals and warmth around fires. They still appreciate the skill and dedication of those who feed them well. Cookie's story is ultimately about more than food. It's about human resilience, creativity, and the power of simple acts of service to create meaning and connection in even the harshest circumstances. These are lessons that remain relevant regardless of how much our world has changed since his time. The chuckwagon is gone, but Cookie's spirit lives on every time someone transforms simple ingredients into a meal that nourishes both body and soul. Every time someone creates community around a shared table. Every time someone demonstrates that cooking is not just about feeding the body, but about caring for the human spirit. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all, that good cooking, like good living, is ultimately about service to others. Cookie understood this truth, lived it daily, and left us an example that continues to inspire more than a century after the last cattle drive reached its destination. The fire has died down to embers now, just as it did each night on the trail, but the warmth of Cookie's legacy lives on, reminding us that simple food, prepared with skill and served with love, can sustain us through any journey, no matter how difficult or uncertain the path ahead might be. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything.